So, singing and silence. There is a common idea around that silence is a very natural and basic state. In fact, except for people who are completely deaf, by which I mean those who have no auditory function whatsoever, silence is only an aspiration. The womb is a very noisy place. The mother's heartbeat, the swishing and gurgling of her digestive system, and the noises around her are a constant accompaniment of fetal development. The work of Frédéric Le Boyer in the 1970s, as part of his gentle childbirth policy, which included ensuring that babies were born into the quietest environment practically possible, was not necessarily the kindest thing to do for the newborn baby, since this quietness would be yet another unfamiliarity when the baby found themselves in very unfamiliar surroundings in every other respect. Although he insisted that the baby should immediately be placed on the mother's stomach so that her heartbeat could continue to be felt, the sound of the mother's heartbeat from the outside is very small compared with what is heard in the womb. Throughout our lives, we can all, if we choose, or maybe sometimes even if we don't so choose, hear the ebb and flow of the blood in the ears occasioned by the heartbeat, and very often the heartbeat itself is clearly audible. It's just that because it's so constant, we normally lose all interest in it. We block it out because it is so pervasive. When coming round from a general anaesthetic, or from having been knocked out in a fall, and I have a very, very limited experience of both those things, for probably at least half a minute, you're likely to hear your heartbeat and the blood flow in the auditory equipment very clearly, while your sensory system reboots and persuades you once again that this sound is so constant that it's not necessary for you to listen to it amongst all the other interesting sounds that are constantly around you. If you're alone for any length of time in an anechoic chamber, a room completely deprived of any resonance characteristics, and you're not making any noise of other kinds, you will soon find yourself hearing heartbeat and possibly auditory blood flow, and maybe the occasional relatively high-pitched whine, which I presume comes from the nervous system, with complete clarity. So, silence is an aspirational state. I won't quite go as far as to say it doesn't really exist, but in clinical absolute terms, that would be true. On Monday evening, I was taken through a yoga nidra, along with about 20 other people on Zoom. The first time I'd done that, and in parenthesis, I must say slightly shamefacedly that although I've had experience of lots of alternative therapies and benefited greatly from them, the one that I've never personally got on with has been yoga. But I know that yoga has many, many facets to it, and this Monday evening was a very rich experience. As part of this nidra, we made the acquaintance of the 7 chakras, the Indian-derived series of energy centers within the body, the 7th and most exalted of which is in the crown of the head, whose function it is not straightforward to describe. Our facilitator referred to it as the chakra of pure consciousness and union with the spirit of the universe. All the other chakras had an associated sound which could be used as a mantra. But the sound of this last, most exalted one was silence. It had no sound associated with it. If I Google the word silence, I get a similar result to Don Oakley's dictionary definition. In my case, complete absence of sound. Since this talk is not really intended to be a stumbling exposure of amateur philosophy, I want you to jump with me several steps and, in the light of the simple description of the 7th chakra I gave you a few seconds ago, I would like to start out from a description of silence as the place where the conscious and the unconscious intermingle. You have, I think, all read my write-up of a coaching group experience of some 35 years ago, I gather some of you have produced some writings about it. Eric Butterworth, by the way, on page 67 of his 1993 book, The Universe is Calling, summarizes this phenomenon very neatly. The interesting thing is that many times, just in the process of letting go, we open the answering flow immediately, and the problem is solved or the condition healed with no further effort required. As you saw from the page of mine that you read, the section title for this story in my duo book was Relinquish, which means ensuring the absence of something. In this case, giving up conscious trying. But what is really interesting is not to explore relinquishment from, but rather to explore relinquishment into. Perhaps even the word explore is too much in the doing rather than the being part of the spectrum of day-to-day behavior. So maybe we should say that we experience and share relinquishment into. I'll stop pouring out definitions in a moment, but here is another which seems to me to be very much in keeping with how it seems to me that the particular short course that you're part of may be evolving. Silence is where I'm enabled to experience things I had not previously known. Here, in order to refresh your ears with a brusque change of style of utterance, is another quotation from Eric Butterworth's book, The Universe is Calling, this time from page 81. Many persons complain that they never have original ideas. They say, oh, it will be nice to be creative. I really admire creative people, but no inspiration ever comes to me. And I often boldly say, why don't you get still and listen? For me, even listen may seem too much in the doing part of the spectrum. I would perhaps prefer, why don't you get still and let yourself experience what you're hearing? Or perhaps listening to what comes to you is a perfect description of the amalgam of conscious and unconscious in this experience. In making my notes for this talk, I see I've jotted down, listening is active silence. Listening to another person is passively embracing that other person. From my experience of being with you on the previous course, I noticed with interest and admiration that Mariam allows a noticeable period or expanse of silence before she begins the audible part of her performance. One of the lessons of lockdown for me was remembering to leave between 20 and 30 seconds of silence between beginning a video recording of the piano part of a song to send to someone for them to sing with. Because early on, I noticed that the starts of video recorded sung performances over piano parts made by some other pianists were horribly damaged by there being virtually no time between the singer switching on the sound equipment and then moving away to an optimum place in the room from which to sing. Many of the most memorable live performances give the impression of being born out of silence and returning to silence at the end before applause eventually germinates. As an aside, I'll point out that it can then be immensely effective if from time to time the exception proves the rule and the pianist starts playing almost before she or he is properly seated at the piano. Gérard Souzet, for some of whose last recitals I had the privilege of playing, was a master at organizing this occasional effect to advantage. I've never been able to find the source of this remark, but I remember being told once that Mozart is supposed to have said that the most important purpose of music is somehow to context and articulate silence. Towards the end of his long life, Fauré developed a habit of making tongue-in-cheek quips, one of which was, all my life I have been trying to express silence in terms of musical sound. What a fool I've been. I am, by the way, totally confident that the last part of this quotation is tongue-in-cheek and does not imply any suggestion that he was in despair about the value of his life's work as a composer. When the philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich wrote a book about the music of Fauré, he entitled it De la musique au silence, from music into silence. One of the most famous compositions of the American composer John Cage, who died at the age of 80 in 1992, is entitled 4 minutes 33 seconds and consists of a pianist sitting at a piano and making no sound for exactly that length of time. Cage, who had a very gentle manner of expression, though the content of what he said was often found by many people at the time to be totally outrageous, was always impressing upon his students that one of the richest of musical experiences was simply to open the window and allow the sounds from outside to enter your consciousness. I'm now going to offer you one of the most interesting quotes from the history of Western music it's ever been my privilege to come across, and which can be explored in very many directions. Those of you who were with me last time, the multi-directional possibilities of this is a bit like the story of the curate who was discombobulated because the children came to the front of the church when I beckoned them. Tonight's quotation comes from François Couperin's little treatise called L'art de toucher le clavecin, the art of playing the harpsichord, published in 1714. Explaining about musical performance, he says, "If there happen to be any listeners, look at them." This highlights, among many other interesting things, the extent to which musical performance is a matter of relating with those who can hear you. And the rest of this little talk is basically going to be about relational silence. 3 vivid, intimate anecdotes first. 2 very happy and 1 rather poignant. In many cultures of the world, it is not necessary to be constantly talking when alone with someone you hardly know. I had known Tomiko Onuma for only a couple of hours when she drove me for just over an hour from a restaurant to a concert venue to rehearse. Admittedly, there was a kind of language barrier here. I had no Japanese, and although she had studied in America about 10 years earlier, her spoken English had become rusty and was far from confident. But that 75 minutes or so, in almost complete silence, was one of the most comfortable and companionable hours of my life. An uncle of mine was a Methodist minister who did a turn of duty in Morecambe, on the Lancashire coast, in the years between the 2 world wars. He loved to report how 2 old men, Bert and Fred, each living alone a few doors apart in the same row of terraced houses, would visit each other one evening every week. They took it in turns who made the journey from one house to the other, and each had a key to the other's house so they could let themselves in with no fuss. They would greet each other, say good evening, and then sit on opposite sides of the fireplace in complete silence for an hour or more. At a given moment, the one whose house it was not would rise and say, "Thanks for another wonderful evening, Fred," or Bert, depending on who was talking. "My place next week, yes?" This would be agreed, and then quietly he would leave and walk, or I believe totter, the few paces back home. I hope that you will feel able to value your audiences as much as the 4 people in these stories were able to value each other in a continuity of long silence. Singing, of course, is both simpler and more complicated than instrumental performance, because it carries with it an element of conversation with a usually silent audience. As you can probably hear from my voice, I've put those last 6 words in inverted commas. because I find it more helpful to suggest this attitude to singers rather than, again using somewhat extreme language, to behave as though their performance was akin to a sung lecture. Now for the unhappy and poignant story. A series of Bachelor of Education exam performances back in the 1970s. A woman of about 40 years of age, looking rather furtive and frightened, came and sat at the piano, discovered complete, attentive, expectant silence from the panel, and started playing extremely well. After a minute or so, the playing deteriorated increasingly rapidly, and suddenly she stopped, stood up, and addressed us with considerable force. "Oh, I wish you were all running around with jam sandwiches in your hands, making a lot of noise like all my children are when I'm playing the piano at home." Ian Spink, our panel chairman, who already had many children and eventually clocked up a tally of 7, fortunately knew all about this scenario, and with incredible compassion and gentle firmness was able to re-rail her, and she continued with a credit-worthy performance, while the panel engaged in a little discreet and unaccustomed creative fidgeting. For yourself, as both performers and teachers, if you are uncomfortable with silence, you will need pragmatically to enable for yourself or for your students a positive relationship with it, bit by bit, probably helped by one or more of the many broadly meditative practices that are available for this purpose, or one or more that you lovingly devise for your own or your students' own characteristics. An indication on a micro level from my coaching work that by and large performers undervalue rather than overvalue silence, or maybe even feel uncomfortable about it, is that rests in the middle of a musical composition are usually performed too short rather than too long. What would be the content of these silences? Reflection, dreaming or daydreaming, fantasizing even, preparation for what's coming, just being, deferred pleasure, maybe even mischievously deferred pleasure, i.e. teasing, suspense, a building up of expectation, maybe including an element of impatience, or a brief moment of infinity. Experiment with pausing your recording at any such points and see if you can divine the content of this particular silence from the visual impression of the still picture. Sometimes composers even have a hand in this aspect of performance presentation. Poulenc, for instance, sometimes writes très long silence, very long silence, between 2 songs in one of his song cycles. This is all linked up with one of my favorite coaching topics, predictive breathing. Also, I would urge you to notice at any given moment if you would prefer your in-breath to be silent or audible. And then, if you have a preference, to ensure that your preference is fulfilled. One absurd but telling detail that is also in this area of exploration comes from a Wigmore Hall recital I partnered in the 80s, where, improbable as it may seem, the excellent singer forgot the last phrase of the last song, which should in any case be preceded by a pause, but the pause on this occasion extended to nearly 20 seconds. There was a very full and appreciative write-up of this concert in the Times, but one of the best-known critics of the day questioned, "But surely it was a miscalculation to wait quite so long before the final phrase of the last song. We were kind of pleased with that remark, since this seemed to indicate that we had maintained the character of the silence perfectly, even if puzzlingly. To sum up, if one can ever sum up such a vast subject, I urge you to trust silence and explore into it with awe and wonder, allowing it to be a friend, maybe even a best friend. Grammatical error deliberate. Silence has no walls. In fact, the practice of silence will release you into being able to realize, in your singing as in every other aspect of your being, a dynamic potential of infinite imagination and creativity that is already within you.